See what happens when you trust other people? Actually important. All right, students. This is the conclusion of the Magic Mountain, the entirety of Mrs. Dalloway, and the conclusion of the course. Let's talk very quickly about the remainder of chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7, very much in summary about the Magic Mountain. And I apologize for not being able to go into the same level of detail that I like to go into with these texts. And yet, this is a concluding day, and so I must paint with slightly broader strokes, as it were. Walpurgis Nacht. Walpurgis Nacht is a title that we remember from Goethe's Faust. It was the night on which the devil and and Faust went to a mountain and saw these witchy deeds. It was very much like a carnival, like a Mardi Gras, we would say, for those of us who live in Louisiana. And such a night, again in Germany, this time in the 20th century, takes place at, or this time in Switzerland, technically, at the Berghof. And during this day, the patients have very different sorts of days. Instead of having their regular 5 meals and the rest cure, they indulge in games. And one of the games that is indulged in, while much drinking is happening, also very like Carnival, as well as Mardi Gras, is a sort of Pictionary. What is necessary for a Pictionary? Pencil, a writing stylus of some sort. And what does Hans Castorp find himself not in possession of, just like that day before art class so long ago when he first approached Sviatoslav Hippa? He finds himself without a pencil. So who does he ask for a pencil from? Well, like his dream suggested so early on, when Sviatoslav Hippa transformed into Madame Shosha, it is Madame Shosha that he goes to. And she hands him a small silver pencil and says, make sure to give it back. I don't have time to go into great detail, but they have a conversation. They have a very cosmopolitan conversation in neither of their mother tongues. Hans Castorp does not speak German. Madame Shosha, though she has a French name, is Russian. She doesn't speak in Russian. They share the language of romance together, French, which Hans Castorp says that he hears better than he speaks. And this is often the case when people are speaking in a language which is tertiary to their primary tongues. In fact, when I was at the Renaissance Society of America's conference this year, many Italians native Italians study the Renaissance, as one would expect, because the Renaissance is often shorthand for the Italian Renaissance. And I was sitting at a table drinking espresso and eating gelato with about 6 Italians, and they would speak in Italian and I would speak in English. And occasionally one of them would speak in both Italian and English. And so it was a little bit like Star Wars. But when you communicate with people across languages, often you are not simply communicating in one language. And so there is a level of realism to this firm. In any case, Madame Shosha says to Hans Castorp, oh, you're an ordinary man. She gives her impressions of him, but not as well-mannered as I thought you would be. And he refuses to call her by proper pronouns. This is the convention that is maintained in German, in Italian, in French, in Spanish. He refuses to give her formal address, as it were, and he calls her by her first name, which is inappropriate, not only given the time, but also given the fact that they do not have an official relationship to each other. And Madame Shosha is in fact Madame Shosha. She is a wife. She is married to another man. And so for Hans Castorp to suggest that he has the privilege of calling her by her first name when they have no developed relationship, when she does have a husband, is very sort of Blazes Boylan sort of move on his part. And speaking of Blazes Boylan moves, we find out after the act, we do not catch them in flagrante delicto. That means caught red-handed, basically. In flagrant dereliction, the literal translation. She does get her pencil back from him, and he takes something we find out he could have only gotten from her room, which is the X-ray negative of her insides. Which means what? Exactly. Means that he must have given her pencil back in her room. What were they doing in the room? Well, I leave that to your imaginations. That said, they very much consummate the sort of unconscious, shadowy relationship that they happen to share, usually by means of slammed doors and furtive looks at each other in the Berghoff. And in fact, Hans Castorp develops a sycophant-like friend in the second half of this story, who the basis of his friendship with Hans Castorp is talking about Madame Shosha and how he venerates Hans Castorp because of the fact that Hans seems to have this carnal knowledge of the object of his own desire. That said, a little bit more on Madame Shosha in a moment when we talk about the Great Dutchman and the Piepercorn. But first, I need to tell you about a character that is very unfortunate that we didn't have more time to experience, precisely because of his acerbic, acidic, vitriolic nature. Leo Nafta. Leo Nafta is himself also a tubercle-ridden individual, just like Settembrini. Settembrini, when he finds out that he will never get better at the Berghoff, takes a very modest lodging outside of the sanatorium and shares a ceiling and or floor with Leo Nafta. Settembrini, as we know from the fact that he only has one set of clothing, always wearing the same pants, is not a rich man. Leo Nafta, however, when we are invited into his home, is full of finery. And this is something of a critique of the order of Catholics that he is a member of, the Jesuit order. The criticism being that they're an extremely rich order that can afford to give finery to those who are a part of it, which is itself sort of an anti-Franciscan vow of poverty way of looking at things. The sort of joke about the Jesuits is that they would not pass the criterion of harder for a rich man to make it into heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. The Jesuits are rich, is the claim that Thomas Mann is making. And that may very much raise a question of, is it appropriate for those who are part of a Christian order to be rich, particularly given the reforms that started in the 13th century among the monastic orders, particularly the Franciscans, who took the very famous vow of poverty. Saint Francis, you may know, himself came from a wealthy family and stripped himself naked in front of his father when he cast off his worldly possessions. He cast off not only his family, but literally the clothes on his back. And so Nafta is something of a bundle of contradictions too. He comes from a poor family, but he is himself extremely talented and shows talent when he sits next to a Jesuit priest and is then invited to a young Catholic or a Catholic school where he can eventually be inducted into the Jesuit order. He makes his bread, as it were, based on his intellect. And he goes deeper and deeper into the Jesuit order because he gets finer and finer things the higher he raises. When he goes from one level of scholarship at the Jesuit school to another, for example, he's given a finer room, a larger room when he makes it to the next order. Leo Nafta is himself often a representation of medieval scholasticism. Scholasticism is a primarily Christian way of thinking that is sometimes called casuistic. So don't get this twisted with casual, which people often misspell when they mean causal, which means to cause something. But casuistic is something even different. To be casuistic is to argue and to splice definitions while arguing simply in order to maintain the argument rather than to approach some truth or fact. The appropriate perspective to take or attitude to take while arguing in order to argue in good faith, as it were, is to try and pursue some truth against somebody who is putting forward something false, or to concede that one is oneself putting forward something false in the wake of stronger reasoning that proves the truth of the alternate perspective. To be casuistic is to know that you are going to win from the beginning, and that no matter what position you are required to take, you will win. And so there's something destructive about Leo Nafta's reasoning. In the same way that Settembrini is representative of the Renaissance, Italian Renaissance, and of Renaissance humanism, and of man being the measure of all things, and of bringing about a progressive moral order. So is Leo Nafta. As a foil to him, far more a figure of the destructive capacity of the intellect. And this reaches ahead when Settembrini and Nafta have a particularly acerbic argument against each other, something of an intellectual duel, which is then followed by Leonafta demanding satisfaction of Settembrini. To demand satisfaction is to demand a physical duel with pistols that they have to borrow because neither of these individuals have pistols and are not fighting men. And Settembrini, who had been asked earlier in the text whether he had anything philosophically against a duel, he says that he would never indulge in one himself, though philosophically he understands it. He accepts the duel. Guns are required. I believe they come from Herr Albin, and they meet. And Hans Castorp tries to keep him from fighting. He fails. Settembrini is allowed the first shot, shoots into the air. Leonafta, apparently wishing that Settembrini would strike him dead, yells "coward." Very similar to the physician giving care to Septimus Warren Smith and Mrs. Dalloway yelling "coward" as he jumps out the window and commits suicide. Suicide is a big part of the end of this course. We have at least 3 of them, and we have 1 left after this in the Magic Mountain to very briefly consider. But in any case, Leonafta yells "coward," and then he turns his weapon on himself. He kills himself, and that is the end of Leonafta, who we have spent so little time considering. Joachim, our stoic lieutenant, as he is described by Settembrini, eventually starts to doubt whether Baron seems to doubt the capacity of the Berghof to cure him, whether it's doubting the Barons, whether it is the fact that Hans Castorp seems to be something like a tourist of the sick rather than someone sick himself. Joachim determines that he must return to the flatlands. He must return to his unit. He must get on with his life, regardless of the fact that Baron says, if you leave, you will be back here in 6 months in a more serious condition. Joachim leaves. Hans Castorp stays, even though he is invited to leave himself on the same day that Joachim leaves. But Hans Castorp obviously doesn't want to. What ambition does he have besides just living a sort of self-indulgent and self-indulgent life? And so Joachim, at first, it sounds like he's doing really well with his regiments, and he's barking orders, and the letters suggest that he's healthy and that he's moving up and things are going great. The letters, however, start to drop off and they start to report sadder things. Now Joachim has had to take leave. Joachim is sick. Joachim has now to return to the Berghof. Their positions are reversed, Hans Castorp and Joachim. So Hans Castorp meets Joachim when Joachim is returning to the Berghof, and with a false sense of sort of comfort and happiness, we know that Joachim is sort of excited when he first gets back to the Berghof because of what? The release of the toxins because of the elevation of the air, or at least is the explanation that we're given from Barons about why it is that this high elevation is important for the study of tuberculosis. But very quickly, Joachim declines and Joachim ends up dying and dies and leaves Hans Castorp alone, which is, I'd say, one of the more poignant moments in this text. And in fact, when later on in the text, near the end, when a phonograph record player makes its way to the Berghof, and Hans Castorp finds himself very much enmeshed in the study of music and Bogart's the record player for himself. Dr. Krokowski finds that there is a young lady among the residents who can win these games of chance. And how is it that she can win these games of chance? Well, she says that she has an invisible friend that tells her which cards other people have when they're playing. Dr. Krokowski determines that this invisible friend is obviously a ghost. And so how does one summon a ghost in order to talk to one? Well, one has what's called, nice French term, a seance. Sort of thing that one imagines a Ouija board at darkness, maybe some candles with wax running down their sides. They have a seance. And at this seance, the question is put, who would you like to summon? Hans Castorp is given the opportunity. Who does he choose? He chooses Joachim. And what happens? sees Joachim. He actually sees him. And Joachim tells him to leave, to get away. He says, I've had my eye on. Joachim speaks to Hans Castorp. This is a very interesting moment because it really makes one wonder, what is the magic in the Magic Mountain? What if a seance works and the spirit can be raised from the dead, is there a God in this place? Is there a place where one's intangible, ostensibly immortal soul goes? Or is this simply a delusion that Hans Castorp has? In the text, it seems pretty real. In fact, he goes and he shakes Dr. Krakowski after this and just gives him a look. What would be in that look? How dare you, create the conditions for this person that I loved showing back up, and who are you to do this? There's a lot in that shake, but I don't have time and perhaps wherewithal to go into all of it at this moment. In any case, besides Leo Nafta being a figure of sort of destructive, conservative, medieval scholasticism, Settembrini being a representative of some progressive Renaissance humanism, there's a third figure who represents a very distinct philosophy of life, Mynheer Peeperkorn, who is known to be an industrialist who made his fortune in the tropics, and in fact has a terrible form of a tropical sickness now, which confines him to his bed every 3 or 4 days. He is very much a sensualist. He orders strong coffee every morning. He orders liquor at every meal, and in fact has a very big party during the rescuers between meals at one point. And he is also completely inarticulate and constantly speaks in what we describe in literary terms as anacoluthon. Anacoluthon is the literary term that means that one interrupts one's own sentences without finishing them. So if I start to, but I go on to, okay, now I'm talking about this. If I start and stop and don't continue my original thought, that is anacoluthon, and that is something that Mynheer Peeperkorn is excellent at doing. And so when you read what it is he's saying, you're always expecting some sort of grand statement from this grand, larger-than-life individual. And yet, the substance of what he has to say is extremely limited. I should add that after Walpurgisnacht and the night shared between Hans Castorp and Madame Scioscia leaves the Berghain. Hans Castorp, while she is gone, stays, and he stays in expectation of her eventual return, not knowing whether or when she will return. But when she does return, she returns with whom? She returns with Mynheer Peeperkorn. And they're staying together, and they have their own special bed. So even though she is married to this Russian dignitary, it is very much the case that her illness allows her freedom and that she can stay at whatever spa/sanatorium she needs to in whichever place for however long, and then take whatever lover that she wants. Hans Castorp in one moment, Mynheer Peeperkorn in another. In order to annoy Madame Scioscia, Hans Castorp becomes a good friend to Mynheer Peeperkorn. But eventually, Hans Castorp is not as smart as he thinks he is. He's very ordinary, right? Mynheer Peeperkorn figures out that Hans Castorp had a relationship with Madame Scioscia, and even asks, and Mynheer Peeperkorn asks Hans Castorp, does it hurt you that I'm with her now? And Hans, he comes up with some sort of equivocating, blathering answer where he's like, well, actually, the relationship with you is so profound that how could I care so much about this relationship with Mynheer? Mynheer is smart. He's an industrialist of extraordinary accomplishment. Even though he doesn't speak particularly articulately, obviously he is wise in the ways of the world to some extent, and was wise enough to be chosen as a romantic partner, or perhaps wise is not the word for this, by Madame Scioscia, and has some sense of what this young man is trying to conceal from him. And he makes what I would imagine would be a very terrifying statement to Hans Castorp. Hans Castorp, who has achieved nothing, compared to this man who is now ill, but has in some ways achieved everything in the world, including what Hans Castorp was, right? He is the one with Madame Scioscia now, the person for whom Hans Castorp was waiting, who he is now denied relationship with. Well, Mynheer Peeperkorn says, if I were a younger man, I were healthy, I would give you satisfaction. Satisfaction again. He would duel with Hans Castor. But he says that since he's old and since he's infirmed, there's no reason for it. And in fact, one day, Hans Castor passes Mynheer's room. It is brought there because of their relationship, in fact, and there's a device with a thorn / tooth, a sharp part of it that is used to administer a poison which is lethal. Apparently, Mynheer Peepercorn had kept a poison from his time in the tropics that was lethal and used it to commit suicide when he found himself at the end of his tether. So he, like Leonapta, commits suicide. He, like Leonapta, like Joachim, find themselves dead. This text, unlike Ulysses, even though it has such a light touch, involves many more deaths during the course of it. We note people who have died during Ulysses. Virag, Bloom's father, Stephen Daedalus's mother, Patty Dignam, but all these people have died prior to the day of Ulysses. These characters in the Magic Mountain died during the course of the text itself. And of course, Hans Castorp's fate, where the narrator with his very light touch leads us, is that eventually, after 7 years, he leaves the Burg Hall. He joins the German military. He becomes an infantryman on the line of a storm. And that's where we leave him. Does he die? Many commentators think yes. And would he have to die at one of the first sieges of 1914 in order to die during a 4-year-long war? No, he could have died in a later battle, but we just don't know. Though he had an extraordinary fate, the narrator of the Magic Mountain told us, is not himself an extraordinary character, and his extraordinary story, which was his own, the narrator reminds us, even though his life goes on, his story is over. It's a moment of poignant loss in us that the character we have come to know, his story is over, and yet his life within the realm of the story itself may continue on without us as voyeuristic viewers. All right, in what ways is this text modernist, I claim? Well, I say that it engages with the neurasthenic malaise of its age. Neurasthenia is an old psychoanalytic diagnosis, often attributed to women. In fact, there's a very famous painting called The Neurasthenic Woman, where there's a woman lying on a green psychoanalytic looking couch with her hand over her face, looking extremely tired. Neurasthenia, like depression, it was a condition of lassitude, of physical lassitude, where one had no energy to get up and do things and no reason to move forward. I suggest that this neurasthenic malaise is in some ways connected to the coming to be of the philosophy of existentialism. Existentialism, we've talked about, says that existence precedes essence. And this is very much a non-Christian, non-religious way of looking at what a human is. A sort of Christian or even a biological way of looking at a human would be like a human has a telos. It's the Greek word for an end towards which to work. And so biologically, if you're thinking of Darwin or Freud, you might think to reproduce. That's the end of a human. If you're thinking in terms of a Christian way, it might be to be anagogic, to lead a life that leads one towards the divine. But if one is an existentialist, one really has to think about what is the reason for existence. I'll suggest a little bit later that postmodernism, unlike modernism, has no answer to this question. That it leaves you with the question, why not suicide? And that it does not have a good answer to that. Whereas modernism more asks, what is the best way to live? Perhaps not the way that you have been living. There is a critical edge to modernism, but rather than leaving you without a step at the top of the staircase, it enables you to walk back down the staircase and to see the steps you have taken for what they truly are. I really, really, really want you to keep that. And if we need to talk about that later, please let us do that. In any case, there is a moral lassitude, a physical lassitude, a philosophical lassitude that afflicts the first part of the 20th century. People don't know the reason to be. That is something that is engaged with very much through Hans Castor, because if he knew what he wanted from life, would he spend 7 years in a sanatorium that he does not need to be in? Joachim doesn't want to be there. He wants to live. He wants to be a fighter. He doesn't have the health for it. Settembrini wants to be a scholar, and a radical scholar who travels to conferences and changes the political order of the world. Can't. He doesn't have the health for it. Hans Castorp, though he may not have the ability to be either of those professions, he could be basically whatever he wants to. And yet he chooses to be nothing. And so this is something that afflicts Hans Castorp. Hans Castorp is himself a figure of at least Germany, but perhaps of all of Western Europe at his time. And a big question I really want you to think about is, what is the relationship between lack of responsibility, lack of philosophical clarity, moral lassitude, and the coming of war? Is it the unconsciousness of individuals within societies that lead to conflict? Which is a slightly different hypothesis from, do societies all have imperial aims which they consciously pursue constantly? Which you could certainly make the case that Germany, both in World War I and World War II, didn't. In any case, there is an interweaving of psychoanalysis and of physical illness. As we talked about in our last class, psychology was a very young science in the 1920s, and particularly in 1907 to 1914, when this text was set, there were the opposing traditions of the American behaviorists with B.F. Skinner, and we talked about operant conditioning, classical conditioning, think of pizza, do you salivate, as opposed to the continental tradition of psychoanalysis that focuses on death and the life instinct, and often used talk therapy and the analysis of dreams and of and even of little everyday psychopathologies like what we now call Freudian slips. Like, so if I say, oh, you bed, I mean, you, the bed student over there or whatever, or like you on the bed, I mean, you over there on the bench. It's like I would be revealing something about what I think of the individual through misspeaking, that I think that the student is bad, for example. And I encourage you to think about whether those sorts of things are telling about the psychological situation one finds himself in. Also, the inclusion of realist details. Remember that realism is a major part of modernism, and this was something that made Don Quixote very interesting, and that we had things like the helmet of Mambrino that was a barber's basin, but also Ulysses itself too, which is so full of everyday details, overfull, you probably all think at this point. But part of the realism of this text are Hans and Joachim's imperialist-minded professions. Hans wants to be an engineer who is reading a work called Ocean Steamships, an engineer who will therefore work on building a navy that will enable Germany to project naval sea power in the world. Joachim wants to be a soldier. This will be part of the buildup of the German military power to World War I as well. Both of their jobs show that Germany is potentially gearing up for an imperialist struggle, to be an imperial power, to project its power beyond its borders, and which is certainly something that did happen, in which Thomas Mann observed, and which he stood against when it came to the Third Reich. Note also the cosmopolitan milieu of languages: Russian, German, French. Something you should know about modernist authors: they're often called cosmopolitan because many of them live in societies that speak languages not their own. For example, Ernest Hemingway was American, he lived in France. T.S. Eliot, he's not the best example because he was American, but then he lived in Britain. And he was actually considered, he not only immigrated to Britain, but became a British citizen and also an Episcopalian. He became very British in a way. Thomas Mann, obviously German, but then moved to California, would later live in Switzerland. So he had to speak some English. James Joyce lived in France for a good bit of time, had to speak French, himself spoke English, and then of course Edward Pound as well, who was an American, but ended up spending quite a bit of time in Italy himself. He was known for having fascist sympathies. This is one of the things that people ethically hold over his head, regardless of his art. Like Martin Heidegger, when it comes to philosophy and sympathy for the Nazis, unlike Thomas Mann, who was always anti-Nazi, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Also, there's the presence of war, World War I at the end of the story. The same way that something that would indicate our age would be a universal experience of, say, COVID and being under lockdown, so was World War I an experience that distinguished anybody in the 1920s. They all lived in the wake of World War I happening, and little did they know, they lived just prior to the coming of World War II. And I suggest, and I would like for you to do with this what you can, that Hans Castorp himself represents an ordinary German, or more widely European, that had his life and fate shaped by what was then called the Great War, World War I. Metempsychosis, constant classical allusions in this text. Rhadamanthus and Minos, judges of the dead, what Settembrini calls Dr. Behrens and Dr. Krokowski. He says that they are themselves the dead who are like flitting shadows without minds. There is one dead character in the Odyssey who does still have his mind. His name is Tiresias, and he is a prophet. Is it the case that Settembrini is this Tiresias figure? Was it Leo Nafta? Was it Mynheer Peeperkorn? Is it Dr. Krokowski? Perhaps none of those, but maybe Settembrini. In any case, Settembrini is himself also a figure of Renaissance humanism. He references Dante. At one point, Hans Castorp himself thinks, what better person to talk to Dante with than an Italian humanist like this Settembrini? Something that's just sort of a sad note is that you will have read Mrs. Dalloway now and seen the poor, traumatized, crazy Septimus Smith. And Septimus Smith, while he's sitting on a bench in the middle of London with his wife Rezia, is reading no other work than Dante's Inferno, which is a disturbing work for somebody who is mentally disturbed to be reading, because it suggests that he, like the characters in this text, is going through hell. This quote here is okay, but it mentions the great Plotinus. Plotinus is a Neoplatonic philosopher who based his thinking on the great Athenian philosopher Plato, and in many ways set the groundwork for medieval theological arguments for the nature of God, particularly Christianity. He makes these points that God is the one, the good, the transcendent, in the same way that those who argue for a transcendent Christian God do. It's a very learned reference. And of course, Settembrini and Nafta themselves, one might argue, are themselves representative of two schools of thought that conflict with each other and were fighting for the European soul, and perhaps continue to fight for the European or Western soul, to include ourselves in that too. Renaissance humanism, Settembrini, versus medieval scholasticism, Nafta. All right. Is this a masterpiece? Well, it's one of the great long novels of the 20th century. Sometimes goes unrecognized due to the fact that Thomas Mann studies were delayed due to his staunch opposition against the Nazis, and how that reflected poorly upon his contemporaries who stayed in Germany and claimed that they did not know what atrocities were occurring due to the Nazi regime. He made them look like they were liars, as we talked about. The narrator also has an extraordinarily light touch in the wake of horror of death by tuberculosis, suicide, and war. These are terrible ways of dying. Think of the Austrian horseman with his raspy cough. Think about how visceral it would be to hear somebody with a terrible cough. Everybody like, and that's probably not bad enough. And yet that was cacophonous, right? Disgusting. You didn't like it. Well, that's something that's included in here, and this narrator still manages to give us a pleasant experience, even though what is being described are people who are physically decayed, while the world itself seems to be experiencing the sort of decay that leads to a world war. Note also the intellectual scope of Settembrini and Nafta. Our main character, our protagonist, Hans Castorp, is not the one that has the finest thoughts in this text. And also note the range of representation of character. Hans is a normal guy. Joachim is a soldier. Frau Shosha, Madame Shosha, is herself described very differently from them, as well as being herself a Russian. Frau Stur, who constantly mispronounces words. Nurse Millendorf in her style, which moves from eye to eye. Director Behrens in his cheeks. Dr. Krokowski in his seances. Mynheer Peeperkorn, his drinking and his eating, and eventually his dying. All of these are details that add up. It is not simply the parts of a text which make it into a masterpiece, nor how they connect together, but the value of each individual part and how it connects to those as well within a masterpiece. If there is tremendous level of thinking, philosophical schools included into a text, and characters represent not only ideas but also manage to seem like humans, as well. This is a high standard of care. This is the high watermark of characterization to represent not only a thought, but also a person. And perhaps this is the high character mark or high watermark of being a person. Okay, I've just got a couple minutes here, but I'm going to talk about Mrs. Dalloway in a nutshell because I thought I'd say a couple things about this text since I really need to. The first line in the text, which is most famous, is Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. Clarissa Dalloway is having a party. And Mrs. Dalloway takes place in London during the course of one day where Clarissa Dalloway thinks about whether she should have married the man Richard Dalloway that she did, or Peter Walsh, with whom she used to have many, many philosophical discussions, who has just returned to London from India the very day before and is sparking all of these thoughts. Note also that she is in her 50s. She is 52. Peter Walsh is 53, just like Don Quixote was in his 50s. So she is a female, older protagonist. So whose entire name is wrapped up in some ways, at least in the title, with her social responsibility ranked with the fact that she is married. She is called Mrs. Dalloway, not Clarissa Dalloway. And I mentioned here that, in fact, there is a novel from 1748 called Clarissa, which is a famous English novel, one of the longest English novels by Samuel Richardson, itself considered a masterpiece. I'd say it's ironic that it's one of the longer novels, because of course Mrs. Dalloway is pretty short. And Virginia Woolf wrote Mrs. Dalloway as a response to Ulysses. Many of you will appreciate that her first engagements with Ulysses, she had nothing good to say about it, and wrote multiple letters about how much she disliked it. But she, perhaps like you, came to grudgingly accept it. I have more details here, but I just can't go to them more. Okay, last thing I'm going to say, I guess, about this text, because I'm going to run out of time, is that you should know the characters. Mrs. Clarissa Dalloway, and how she spends the day thinking about her party, thinking about her daughter, thinking about the religious influence of the woman teaching her daughter, who resents her. Know also that in this text, we are given many, many, many different perspectives. The main characters are Septimus Warren Smith, who unfortunately committed suicide during the course of the text, Peter Walsh, who's just returned from India, as well as Clarissa Dalloway. But we get insight into even the wife, the Italian wife of Septimus Warren Smith, Lucrezia, and how nervous and how scared she is to admit that her husband is mad. She'll never admit it to anybody. And yet, it is the case that he is in fact mad and does commit suicide. He was himself represented as a soldier who fought in World War I, was promoted, was a noble soldier, but suffered the trauma that could happen during trench warfare. And well, that's, I guess, where we're going to have to end. And here I'd say to you, for now, you two must leave the Berghoff, but not quite yet because you have a final exam on Monday. All right.